In the marble corridors of Valdoria's grand palace, where whispered secrets hold more power than royal decrees, a single moment would shatter centuries of tradition. When Queen Consort Isabella found herself face to face with an unyielding royal guard, blocking her path to the throne room, she never imagined that Prince Alexander's thunderous arrival would expose the web of betrayal that had been spinning in the shadows of the crown. What started as a simple security protocol would unravel into the most explosive royal scandal in Valdoria's history, threatening to tear apart not just a marriage, but the very foundation of the monarchy itself. Behind closed doors, loyalties were tested, alliances crumbled, and the true cost of power was about to be revealed. Some confrontations change everything. This was one of them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Valdoria Palace as Queen Consort Isabella made her way through the eastern corridor. Her emerald silk gown rustled softly with each measured step, the sound echoing through the vast hallways that had witnessed centuries of royal drama. Today would add another chapter to that history, though Isabella had no way of knowing it yet. She had been summoned to an urgent meeting with King Edmund regarding the upcoming state dinner for the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. The diplomatic implications were significant, as tensions between the two nations had been escalating over trade disputes and border disagreements. Isabella, known for her sharp political mind and diplomatic skills, was often called upon to help navigate such delicate situations. As she approached the throne room's massive oak doors, adorned with the royal crest of Valdoria, Isabella noticed something unusual. Captain Marcus Thorne, the head of the royal guard, stood rigidly before the entrance. His usually respectful demeanor seemed strangely formal, almost hostile. Behind him, two additional guards flanked the doorway, their hands resting on the hilts of their ceremonial swords. "Captain Thorne," Isabella addressed him with the authority befitting her position. "I have been summoned by His Majesty. Please step aside." The captain's weathered face remained impassive. His steel-grey eyes, which had seen decades of service to the crown, met hers without wavering. "I'm afraid I cannot allow that, Your Majesty. The king has given explicit orders that no one is to enter the throne room until further notice." Isabella's carefully maintained composure flickered for just a moment. In her 5 years as queen consort, she had never been denied access to any part of the palace. The throne room, in particular, was where she and Edmund often held their most important discussions about matters of state. "Captain, I believe there has been some misunderstanding," she said, her voice carrying the measured tone she used during diplomatic negotiations. "His Majesty specifically requested my presence." "Perhaps you could verify this with him directly." "The orders came from the king himself, Your Majesty. I am not at liberty to question them." Captain Thorne's response was clipped, professional, but there was something else in his voice. Was it reluctance? Or perhaps something more troubling? Isabella studied the captain's face more carefully. She had always prided herself on reading people, a skill that had served her well in the political arena. Marcus Thorne was a man of honor, someone who had served the royal family faithfully for over 20 years. His loyalty to the crown was unquestioned, yet something about his current demeanor suggested internal conflict. "Very well," Isabella said finally, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. "When might I expect to speak with the king?" "The Astorian delegation arrives tomorrow, and there are crucial details we must discuss." "I have no information regarding that, Your Majesty. I suggest you await further word in your chambers." The suggestion felt more like a command, and Isabella bristled at the implication. She was not a child to be sent to her room, nor was she some minor courtier to be dismissed at will. She was the queen consort of Valdoria, second only to the king in authority and respect. As she turned to leave, Isabella's mind began working through the possible explanations for this unprecedented situation. Had Edmund received troubling news about the Astorian negotiations? Was there some security threat she was unaware of? Or was something more personal at play? The walk back to her private quarters felt longer than usual. The palace corridors, normally filled with the quiet bustle of servants and courtiers going about their duties, seemed oddly deserted. The few people she encountered quickly averted their eyes and hurried past, their behavior adding to her growing sense of unease. Isabella's chambers occupied the entire east wing of the palace's upper floor. The rooms were elegantly appointed with antique furniture, priceless artworks, and windows that offered sweeping views of the royal gardens. Under normal circumstances, these surroundings provided her with comfort and tranquility. Today, they felt like gilded walls of a prison. She dismissed her ladies-in-waiting and settled into the window seat overlooking the gardens. The autumn roses were in full bloom, their deep red petals catching the late afternoon light. Edmund had planted those roses for her during their first year of marriage, a gesture that had touched her deeply. Now, as she watched a gardener carefully tending to them, she wondered if those days of romantic gestures and shared dreams were becoming nothing more than distant memories. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside her chambers drew Isabella's attention. She recognized the quick, purposeful stride immediately. Prince Alexander, Edmund's younger brother and heir to the throne, was heading in her direction. The footsteps paused outside her door, followed by a sharp knock. "Enter," Isabella called, smoothing her skirts and adopting a composed posture. Prince Alexander strode into the room, his dark hair slightly disheveled and his usually immaculate uniform bearing signs of recent travel. At 32, he possessed the same strong jawline and piercing blue eyes as his brother. But where Edmund had grown more reserved and calculating over the years, Alexander attained an passionate intensity that could be both inspiring and unsettling. "Isabella," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "I need to speak with you immediately. It's about Edmund." The Queen Consort gestured to the chair across from her window seat. "Please, sit. You look as though you've ridden hard to get here. Has something happened?" Alexander remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. "I've just returned from the northern provinces, where I was investigating reports of unrest among the mining communities. But that's not why I'm here. Isabella, I need to ask you directly, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you noticed anything unusual about Edmund's behavior recently?" The question caught Isabella off guard. She had indeed noticed changes in her husband over the past few months. Edmund had become increasingly secretive, holding private meetings that excluded her, making decisions about kingdom affairs without consulting her as he once did. She had attributed these changes to the mounting pressures of ruling a kingdom facing both internal challenges and external threats. "What kind of unusual behavior?" she asked carefully. "Secretive meetings, unexplained absences, changes in his normal routines. And more importantly, has he said anything to you about changing the succession laws?" Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. The succession laws of Valdoria were ancient and sacred, establishing the direct line of inheritance from monarch to eldest child, or, in the absence of children, to the monarch's siblings in order of birth. As Edmund and Isabella had no children after 5 years of marriage, Alexander was the rightful heir to the throne. "No, he hasn't mentioned anything about succession," she replied slowly. "Alexander, what exactly are you suggesting?" Before the prince could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. These weren't the measured steps of servants or the quick pace of courtiers. These were the boots of armed men, moving with military precision. Isabella and Alexander exchanged glances, both recognizing the ominous implications. The footsteps stopped directly outside Isabella's chambers. A moment later, Captain Thorne's voice could be heard giving orders to his men. The words were muffled by the thick oak door, but the tone was unmistakably that of someone preparing for a confrontation. Alexander moved to the window, his warrior's instincts assessing potential escape routes. "Isabella, I think we may be in more danger than we realized. The information I uncovered in the northern provinces suggests that Edmund has been in secret communication with certain faction leaders who oppose the traditional monarchy. There are whispers of a plan to restructure the entire government, with Edmund as a more authoritarian ruler." "That's impossible," Isabella protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Edmund believes in the constitutional monarchy our family has upheld for generations. He would never attempt to seize absolute power. Power changes people, Isabella. And when that power is threatened by economic instability and political unrest, even good men can make terrible choices." The sound of approaching voices grew louder. Isabella could now distinguish Captain Thorne's gruff tones mixed with what sounded like heated argument. Someone else was in the corridor. Someone whose presence had clearly agitated the usually unflappable captain. Alexander's hand instinctively moved to the sword at his side. Despite being a prince, he had insisted on receiving military training and had served briefly with the kingdom's elite forces. Those skills might prove valuable if their worst fears were confirmed. "If what you're suggesting is true," Isabella said quietly, "then my being barred from the throne room wasn't about protecting me from some external threat. It was about keeping me away from whatever Edmund is planning."
"Exactly."
"And if Edmund is moving to consolidate power and eliminate potential opposition, then both of us represent significant obstacles to his plans. You, as his wife and closest advisor, know too much about his activities. And I, as his heir, represent the traditional order he may be trying to overthrow." The voices in the corridor suddenly ceased, followed by intense silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Isabella found herself holding her breath, straining to hear any sound that might indicate what was happening beyond her door. Then, cutting through the quiet like a blade, came a voice that made both Isabella and Alexander freeze. It was Edmund's voice, but not as they had ever heard it before. Gone was the measured, thoughtful tone of a constitutional monarch. In its place was something harder, more commanding, touched with an edge of fury that neither had ever witnessed. "Captain Thorne, I gave you explicit instructions. Why is my brother not in custody as ordered?" The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. Edmund had ordered Alexander's arrest? The implications were staggering and terrifying. If the king was moving against his own brother, then the situation was far worse than either of them had imagined. Alexander's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady as he whispered to Isabella, "We need to leave now." But before either of them could move toward the window, the sound of a key turning in the lock of Isabella's chamber door made it clear that escape was no longer an option. Whatever Edmund had planned, whatever forces he had set in motion, they were about to find themselves at the center of a storm that would test not only their survival, but the very foundations of the kingdom they had sworn to serve and protect. The chamber door swung open, with deliberate slowness, revealing King Edmund, framed in the doorway, like a figure from a dark painting. His usually pristine royal uniform was wrinkled, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and inner turmoil. Behind him stood Captain Thorne, his face a mask of professional duty, warring with personal conflict. "Brother," Edmund said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument, "you will come with me. Now." Alexander stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Isabella in a protective gesture. "Edmund, what is the meaning of this? Why are armed guards surrounding the Queen's chambers? Why was Isabella denied access to the throne room?" Edmund's eyes, once warm and filled with the idealism of youth, now held a coldness that Isabella had never seen before. When he looked at her, there was no trace of the man who had courted her with poetry and promised to build a better kingdom together. "Isabella is no longer your concern, Alexander. Her role in our kingdom's future has been reassessed." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications of Edmund's statement became clear. This wasn't just about political maneuvering or constitutional changes. This was about her very existence as queen, as Edmund's wife, as a person with any standing in the kingdom she had served faithfully for 5 years. "Edmund!" she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I am your wife. I am the queen consort of Valdoria. You cannot simply decide that my role has been reassessed as if I were some minor court appointment." Edmund's laugh was bitter and devoid of humor. "My dear Isabella, you seem to be operating under the misconception that our marriage was ever anything more than a political alliance, one that has outlived its usefulness." The cruelty of his words struck Isabella like a physical blow, but it was Alexander who reacted first. In one fluid motion, he drew his sword, the blade singing as it cleared the scabbard. The sound seemed to fill the chamber with electricity, transforming what had been a tense family confrontation into something far more dangerous. "You will not speak to Isabella in that manner," Alexander declared, his voice carrying the authority of both royal blood and military training. "Whatever madness has taken hold of you, Edmund, it ends now." Captain Thorne's hand moved to his own weapon, but his movement was hesitant. Isabella could see the conflict written across his weathered features. This was a man who had sworn loyalty to the crown, but he was also someone who had watched both princes grow from boys to men, who had served their father before them. "Stand down, Alexander," Edmund commanded. "You are outnumbered, and your resistance serves no purpose except to make this more difficult for everyone involved." "Difficult?" Alexander's sword remained steady, pointed directly at his brother's chest. "You speak of difficulty while attempting to arrest your own brother and cast aside your wife. What has happened to you, Edmund? What have you done?" For a moment, something flickered across Edmund's face. Was it regret? Uncertainty? But the expression vanished so quickly that Isabella might have imagined it. When he spoke again, his voice had regained its cold authority. "I have done what is necessary for the survival of our kingdom. The old ways, the old alliances, the old promises, they are relics of a time when Valdoria could afford to be weak. That time has ended." Isabella found her voice, though it trembled with emotion she was struggling to control. "What are you talking about? Our kingdom is not weak. Yes, we face challenges, but we have always overcome them, through diplomacy, through unity, through the very principles our family has upheld for generations. Principles? Edmund turned his full attention to her, and the intensity of his gaze made her step back involuntarily. Tell me, Isabella, how have your precious principles served us with the Asturian trade dispute? How have they helped us deal with the unrest in the northern provinces? How have they prevented the neighboring kingdoms from seeing us as easy prey? Those are complex issues that require time and careful negotiation, Isabella replied, though she could hear the defensive tone in her own voice. Diplomacy isn't about quick fixes, Edmund. It's about building lasting solutions that benefit everyone involved. Lasting solutions. Edmund's voice dripped with disdain. While you've been crafting your diplomatic solutions, I've been learning some uncomfortable truths about our kingdom's position. We are surrounded by nations that see our commitment to constitutional monarchy as weakness. They're forming alliances against us, planning to divide our territory among themselves, like vultures feeding on a corpse. Alexander lowered his sword slightly, though he maintained his defensive stance. Even if that were true, the answer isn't to become the very thing our enemies claim we should be. The answer is to prove them wrong by showing strength through unity and justice. Unity? Edmund laughed harshly. You want to talk about unity? Let me tell you about the unity I discovered during my recent travels. The unity of nobles who whisper about replacing our family with rulers who will give them greater power over their lands. The unity of merchants who prefer dealing with autocratic regimes because they find democracy inconvenient for their business interests. The unity of military commanders who grow frustrated with having their decisions questioned by civilian oversight. Isabella felt a chill of recognition. Edmund's words echoed conversations she had heard in fragments, comments made during court gatherings that she had dismissed as the usual complaints of those who always believed they could run things better. Had there really been a more organized movement brewing beneath the surface of court life? So, your solution is to give them what they want? She asked. To abandon everything our family has built, everything we believe in, just to appease those who would tear down our constitution? My solution is to survive, Edmund replied coldly. And to ensure that Valdoria survives as well, even if it means adapting to new realities. Captain Thorne cleared his throat, a sound that drew everyone's attention. Your Majesty, he addressed Edmund formally. If I may suggest, perhaps this conversation would be better continued in a more private setting. The corridors have ears, and such sensitive matters are no longer secret, Edmund finished. Captain, tomorrow's announcements will make everything clear, but you're right that we shouldn't linger here. He looked directly at Isabella. You will accompany me to the throne room. There are documents that require your signature. What kind of documents? Alexander demanded, raising his sword again. Documents that will formalize the end of our marriage, Edmund said to Isabella, completely ignoring his brother's weapon. An annulment, citing our failure to produce an heir and incompatible views on governing. You will sign them, and you will do so willingly, or the consequences will be most unpleasant. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Isabella's sharp intake of breath. An annulment would not only end their marriage, but would also strip her of any legal standing in the kingdom. Worse, it would effectively declare that their marriage had never been valid in the first place, nullifying 5 years of her life and service. And what of Alexander? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Alexander will be charged with treason for his opposition to legitimate royal authority. He will be given the choice between exile and imprisonment, depending on how cooperative he proves to be going forward. Treason? Alexander's voice cracked with disbelief. For questioning your sudden transformation into a tyrant? For defending our family's honor and traditions? For protecting my sister-in-law from your inexplicable cruelty? Treason for drawing a sword against your king, Edmund replied matter-of-factly. Treason for refusing to acknowledge the new order. Treason for persisting in outdated notions of how power should be exercised in a changing world. Isabella's mind raced through the implications. If Edmund succeeded in this plan, he would have eliminated both his designated heir and his queen in one swift move. He would be free to remarry, perhaps to form a more advantageous political alliance with one of the neighboring kingdoms he claimed to fear. He could restructure the government to give himself greater power while claiming it was necessary for national security. But there was something else. Something that didn't quite fit with Edmund's claimed motivations. If he truly believed the kingdom was in danger from external threats, why was his first move to destroy the internal structures that had kept Valdoria stable? Why start by attacking the people who should be his closest allies? Edmund, she said quietly, who have you been meeting with? These ideas, this plan, They don't sound like something you developed on your own. Someone has been advising you, convincing you that this course of action is necessary. Who is it? For the first time since entering the room, Edmund looked genuinely uncomfortable. His eyes flickered away from hers, and she caught a glimpse of the uncertainty he had been hiding behind his mask of cold authority. "That is not your concern," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "It is absolutely my concern," Isabella pressed, sensing weakness. "Someone has poisoned your mind against your own family, your own wife, your own principles. Someone has convinced you that the only way to save Valdoria is to destroy everything that made it worth saving in the first place. Who is it, Edmund?" Alexander lowered his sword completely, recognizing that Isabella had identified something crucial. "Brother, she's right. This isn't you. 5 months ago, you were talking about expanding the Parliament, giving more voice to the common people. You were planning educational reforms and diplomatic initiatives. What changed? Who got to you?" The silence stretched on, and Isabella could see Edmund struggling with some internal battle. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Lord Chancellor Blackwood convinced me that sometimes a king must choose between being loved and being effective. He showed me documents, reports, evidence that our enemies are closer than we thought. He explained that the only way to prevent invasion and occupation was to become strong enough that no one would dare threaten us." Isabella's heart sank. Lord Chancellor Blackwood was Edmund's oldest advisor, a man who had served the royal family since before Edmund's birth. If Blackwood was behind this transformation, then the corruption ran deeper than either she or Alexander had imagined. More troubling still, Blackwood was known for his intelligence and cunning. If he had decided that the constitutional monarchy needed to be overthrown, he would have planned every detail carefully. "Where is Lord Blackwood now?" she asked. "Waiting in the throne room," Edmund replied. "He's prepared the documents, arranged for the announcements, coordinated with the military commanders who will help maintain order during the transition." Alexander and Isabella exchanged glances. They both understood that they were not just facing Edmund's personal crisis of conscience. They were up against a carefully orchestrated coup, one that had been months in the planning and was now reaching its culmination. The sound of more footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted their conversation. These were different from the measured pace of guards. These were the hurried steps of someone bringing urgent news. A young page burst through the still-open doorway, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Your Majesty," he gasped, addressing Edmund while trying to catch his breath, "Lord Chancellor Blackwood requests your immediate presence in the throne room. He says the Asturian delegation has arrived early, and there are complications with the negotiations." Edmund's face darkened. "Complications? What kind of complications?" "I don't know the details, Your Majesty. The Lord Chancellor said to tell you that the situation requires your urgent attention, and that you should bring the Queen and Prince Alexander with you."
Isabella felt a chill run down her spine.
If Blackwood wanted all three of them in the throne room together, it wasn't for negotiations with the Asturians. It was for the final act of whatever plan he had been orchestrating. The moment of truth was approaching, and none of them were prepared for what they might find waiting in the heart of the palace. The walk to the throne room felt like a march to the gallows. Edmund led the way, his shoulders rigid with tension that seemed to increase with every step. Behind him, Isabella and Alexander walked side by side, their earlier antagonism replaced by a shared understanding that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. Captain Thorne and 2 additional guards brought up the rear, their presence serving as both protection and imprisonment. As they moved through the palace corridors, Isabella noticed details she had overlooked during her earlier frustrated journey. The usual complement of servants and minor courtiers was nowhere to be seen. The palace felt eerily empty, as if everyone had been deliberately cleared from the areas they would pass through. More ominously, she spotted additional guards posted at strategic intervals, men she didn't recognize who wore the royal uniform but carried themselves with the bearing of soldiers rather than ceremonial protectors. "Edmund," she said quietly, "where is everyone? Where are Lady Margaret and the other ladies of the court? Where are the ambassadors and advisors who should be preparing for tomorrow's state dinner?" Edmund didn't turn around, but his pace slowed slightly. "They've been temporarily relocated to other quarters. Lord Blackwood felt it would be better to minimize complications during this transitional period." "Complications?" Alexander's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You mean witnesses. Blackwood has isolated us from anyone who might object to whatever he has planned." This time, Edmund did stop, turning to face his brother with an expression that mixed anger and something that might have been guilt. "Alexander, You need to understand that this isn't some villainous plot. 1. These measures are necessary for the greater good of the kingdom. Sometimes leadership requires making difficult decisions that others might not immediately understand. Leadership requires courage to do what's right, not what's convenient, Alexander replied. Father understood that. He faced challenges just as serious as the ones we're dealing with now, but he never considered abandoning his principles or betraying the trust of those who depended on him. Father lived in a different time, Edmund said, but his voice lacked conviction. The threats we face today are more sophisticated, more dangerous. Our enemies have learned to exploit our commitment to democratic governance. They use our own laws and traditions against us. Isabella watched her husband's face carefully as he spoke. She had spent 5 years learning to read his expressions, understanding the subtle signs that indicated doubt or certainty, confidence or fear. What she saw now was a man trying desperately to convince himself as much as them. Edmund wasn't the mastermind of this transformation. He was its victim, manipulated by someone far more cunning and ruthless than he could ever be. Tell me about these threats, she said gently. Help me understand what convinced you that such drastic measures were necessary. What exactly did Lord Blackwood show you? Edmund's eyes flickered with uncertainty. There were documents, intelligence reports from our spies in neighboring kingdoms, evidence of military buildups along our borders, secret treaties being negotiated without our knowledge, economic warfare designed to weaken our trade relationships.
And you verified this intelligence independently? Alexander asked.
You consulted with other advisors, cross-referenced the information with our own military commanders? The silence that followed was answer enough. Edmund had accepted Blackwood's information without question, trusting in the loyalty and wisdom of a man who had served his family for decades. It was exactly the kind of mistake that a good man with limited experience in deception might make when faced with someone skilled in manipulation. Lord Blackwood has served our family faithfully for 30 years, Edmund said defensively. He has no reason to mislead me about threats to our kingdom. He has every reason if he has his own agenda, Isabella replied. Edmund, think about what he's asking you to do. You're destroying your marriage, exiling your brother, and abandoning the constitutional principles our family has upheld for generations. What does Blackwood gain if you follow through with this plan? Before Edmund could answer, they reached the great doors of the throne room. The massive oak portals carved with scenes from Valdoria's history stood partially open. Through the gap, Isabella could see the flicker of candlelight and hear the low murmur of voices in conversation. Someone was indeed waiting for them inside. Captain Thorne stepped forward to announce their arrival, but Edmund raised a hand to stop him. That won't be necessary, Captain. Lord Blackwood is expecting us. As they entered the throne room, Isabella was struck immediately by how different it felt from her normal visits to this sacred space. The great hall, which usually felt spacious and filled with light streaming through tall windows, now seemed smaller and more oppressive. Heavy curtains had been drawn across most of the windows, and the lighting came primarily from candelabras placed around the perimeter of the room. The effect was to create a sense of secrecy and conspiracy, rather than the open governance the room was designed to represent. Lord Chancellor Blackwood stood near the throne, a tall, austere figure in his formal robes of office. At 65, he remained impressive in bearing, with silver hair and penetrating dark eyes that seemed to catalogue everything and everyone around him. He had been handsome in his youth, and traces of that appeal remained, lending him a charismatic presence that had served him well in decades of political maneuvering. But it wasn't Blackwood's presence that made Isabella's blood run cold. It was the presence of the other figures in the room. Near the great fireplace stood General Harrison, the commander of Valdoria's military forces, along with 2 other men in military uniform whom Isabella didn't recognize. Their presence suggested that whatever Blackwood had planned, it had the backing of at least some portion of the kingdom's armed forces. More troubling still were the 3 men in civilian clothes who stood near the far wall. Isabella recognized them as representatives of the merchant guilds, wealthy and influential traders who had often expressed frustration with the kingdom's democratic processes when they interfered with profitable business ventures. Their presence here, at what was supposed to be a private royal meeting, indicated that Blackwood's conspiracy extended well beyond the palace walls. Your Majesty, Lord Blackwood said, offering a deep bow to Edmund while completely ignoring Isabella and Alexander. Thank you for joining us. I trust you have explained to your companions the nature of today's proceedings? I've explained what needs to be explained, Edmund replied, though his voice carried less authority than it had earlier. Being in this room, surrounded by these conspirators, seemed to be having an effect on his confidence. Excellent. Then we can proceed without delay. Blackwood gestured toward a small table that had been placed near the throne. On it lay several documents, an ornate writing set, and what appeared to be the royal seal. The annulment papers are prepared and require only your signature, Your Majesty, along with the Queen's acknowledgement of the proceedings. Isabella stepped forward, her diplomatic training taking over despite the surreal nature of the situation. Lord Blackwood, I demand to know under what authority you presume to arrange the dissolution of a royal marriage. Such proceedings require extensive legal review, consultation with religious authorities, and approval from the Privy Council. None of those steps have been taken. Blackwood's smile was cold and predatory. My dear Isabella, you seem to be laboring under the misconception that normal legal processes apply in times of national emergency. His Majesty has declared such an emergency, granting him extraordinary powers to act in the kingdom's best interests. What emergency? Alexander demanded, his hand once again moving toward his sword. The only threat to this kingdom that I can see is standing in this room conspiring against legitimate royal authority. General Harrison stepped forward, his gruff voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. Prince Alexander, you would do well to moderate your tone. The emergency is real, and it requires immediate action to prevent foreign invasion and internal collapse. Show me the evidence, Alexander challenged. Show me proof of this emergency that justifies overthrowing our laws and traditions. Blackwood nodded to one of his civilian allies, who approached carrying a leather portfolio. The evidence is extensive and detailed. Foreign armies gathering on our borders, secret alliances formed against us, economic pressures designed to bankrupt our treasury. The traditional methods of governance are too slow and cumbersome to address such immediate threats. Isabella accepted the portfolio and began examining its contents, her diplomatic experience helping her assess the quality and reliability of the information. What she found was troubling, but not in the way Blackwood intended. The documents were real enough, but they painted a picture of normal diplomatic and economic activity, rather than the coordinated assault Blackwood claimed to see. This shows increased military exercises in Astoria and Belgrave, she said, after scanning several pages. Military exercises are routine and are usually announced well in advance. This document here shows trade negotiations between several neighboring kingdoms, but such negotiations happen constantly and don't necessarily indicate hostile intent toward Valdoria. You're reading the surface information, Blackwood replied smoothly. The real intelligence comes from interpreting patterns, understanding the strategic implications of these seemingly innocent activities. Or from choosing to see threats where none exist, Alexander interjected. Lord Blackwood, your interpretation of this evidence is designed to support a predetermined conclusion. You've decided that democracy is inconvenient for your purposes, so you've created a crisis to justify abandoning it. The accusation hung in the air like an unveiled sword. Isabella could see the effect it had on Edmund, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation progressed. Her husband was many things, but he was not stupid. He was beginning to see the gaps in Blackwood's reasoning, the convenient way that the evidence supported exactly the course of action Blackwood wanted to pursue. Edmund, Isabella said quietly, before you sign anything, before you make any irreversible decisions, I need you to consider something. If Lord Blackwood is correct about these threats, if our kingdom is truly in immediate danger, then the solution should be to unite our people and rally our allies. Instead, he's asking you to divide our royal family, alienate our traditional supporters, and abandon the principles that have made other kingdoms see us as trustworthy allies. How does that make us stronger? For a long moment, Edmund stood silent, his eyes moving from Isabella to Blackwood to the assembled conspirators. Isabella could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Part of him wanted to believe in Blackwood's vision of decisive leadership and necessary sacrifices. But another part of him, the part that had fallen in love with her and had dreamed of being a just and beloved king, was beginning to reassert itself. Lord Blackwood, Edmund said slowly, perhaps we should postpone these proceedings until I've had time to review the evidence more thoroughly. The accusations against my wife and brother are serious, and I want to be certain that they're justified. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Blackwood's carefully controlled expression flickered, revealing a flash of anger and frustration. Your Majesty, delay is a luxury we cannot afford. Every moment we spend in discussion gives our enemies more time to act against us. The documents must be signed today, the announcements made immediately. Then you won't mind if I take a few hours to study the situation more carefully, Edmund replied, his voice gaining strength. I am still the King of Valdoria, and I will not be rushed into decisions that will affect the kingdom for generations to come. It was then that Isabella realized just how carefully Blackwood had planned this entire scenario. The Lord Chancellor's expression shifted from frustration to something much more dangerous. He nodded slightly to General Harrison, who in turn gestured to the guards stationed around the room. "I'm afraid, Your Majesty," Blackwood said with false regret, "that delay is no longer an option. You see, the emergency I mentioned has already begun. Reports have reached us that hostile forces are moving toward our borders as we speak. The kingdom is under martial law as of this moment, and I have assumed temporary authority to coordinate our defense." The reality of their situation crystallized with horrible clarity. This hadn't been a negotiation or even a manipulation. It had been a coup, carefully orchestrated, and now reaching its climax. Blackwood had never intended to give Edmund a choice in the matter. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal that the choice had already been made. As guards moved to surround them, Isabella realized that their survival now depended not on diplomacy or legal arguments, but on actions none of them had been prepared to take. Time for talking was over, and the time for fighting had begun. The moment Blackwood revealed the true extent of his plot, the throne room erupted into controlled chaos. Guards moved with practiced precision, clearly operating under orders that had been given well in advance. Isabella found herself surrounded by armed men whose loyalty had been purchased or coerced by the Lord Chancellor's promises of power and wealth in his new order. But Edmund's reaction was not what Blackwood had anticipated. Instead of the resigned acceptance the conspirator had expected, the king's face flushed with anger and betrayal. The spell of manipulation that had been carefully woven over months of meetings and fabricated intelligence shattered in an instant. "You treacherous bastard," Edmund snarled, his royal composure completely abandoned. "You've played me for a fool, used my love of country against me, turned me against my own family." His hand moved to his sword, though he was clearly outnumbered. Blackwood's mask of respectful servitude finally fell away completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "Your Majesty, your emotional attachment to outdated concepts of honor and family loyalty is precisely why you are unfit to lead Valdoria in these troubled times. Step aside gracefully, and you may retain some dignity in your retirement." Retirement? Alexander's sword was now fully drawn, its polished blade reflecting the candlelight menacingly. "You speak of retirement when you mean assassination. Did you really think we would believe that you planned to allow Edmund to live after orchestrating this coup?" General Harrison stepped forward, his own weapon drawn but held in a defensive rather than aggressive posture. Isabella noted with interest that the military man seemed uncomfortable with the direction events were taking. Perhaps not all of Blackwood's allies were as committed to treachery as he had believed. "Prince Alexander," the general said carefully, "lower your weapon. There need be no bloodshed here. Lord Blackwood has convinced me that these actions are necessary for the kingdom's survival, but I have no desire to harm the royal family." "Then you're either a fool or a coward," Alexander replied harshly. "Can't you see that Blackwood is using you just as he used my brother? Once he has eliminated the legitimate royal authority, what makes you think he'll allow military commanders who might challenge his power to remain in their positions?" The question struck home. Isabella could see doubt creeping across General Harrison's weathered features. A career military officer, he had sworn oaths of loyalty to the crown that went deeper than political convenience. The realization that he had been manipulated into betraying those oaths was beginning to dawn on him. But before anyone could respond to Alexander's challenge, a new complication entered the situation. Captain Thorne, who had been standing silently near the throne room entrance, suddenly drew his sword and placed himself between the royal family and Blackwood's guards. "I've heard enough," the captain announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making life-or-death decisions. "Lord Blackwood, you may have corrupted some members of this court, but you have not corrupted the royal guard. My oath was sworn to protect the legitimate sovereign of Valdoria, not to enable the ambitions of treacherous advisors." The intervention of Captain Thorne changed the dynamics of the confrontation dramatically. Several of the guards who had been moving to surround the royal family hesitated, clearly uncertain about which authority to obey. These were men who had served under Thorne's command for years, who respected his judgment and integrity. Blackwood's careful plan was beginning to unravel, but he was far too experienced in political maneuvering to surrender easily. "Captain Thorne, you disappoint me. I had hoped that you, at least, would understand the necessity of these actions." "Guards, arrest Captain Thorne for treason along with the others." Several guards moved to comply, but their advance was hesitant and uncertain. Isabella realized that this was the moment when loyalties would be tested and the fate of the kingdom would be decided. Everything depended on the choices made by ordinary people caught between competing claims to authority and conflicting oaths of loyalty. "Wait," she called out, her voice carrying the diplomatic authority she had developed through years of international negotiations. "Before anyone else draws blood in this sacred place, I want everyone in this room to understand exactly what Lord Blackwood is asking you to do." The unexpected intervention from the Queen caused everyone to pause. Isabella stepped forward, moving into the center of the room where everyone could see and hear her clearly. "Lord Blackwood claims to be acting to protect Valdoria from external threats. But look around this room. The only people pointing weapons at each other are Valdorians. The only blood that's about to be spilled is Valdorian blood. The only government that's being overthrown is our own. How exactly does civil war make us stronger against foreign enemies?" One of the younger guards lowered his sword slightly, clearly affected by her words. Isabella pressed her advantage. "More importantly, look at who benefits from Lord Blackwood's plan. He eliminates the king, exiles the heir, dissolves the marriage that might produce future heirs, and assumes emergency powers that he will never voluntarily surrender. This isn't about protecting Valdoria. This is about one man's ambition to rule a kingdom that was never his birthright." "Enough!" Blackwood snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. "Guards, I order you to arrest these traitors immediately. Anyone who fails to obey will be charged with treason and executed." But the threat backfired spectacularly. The assembled guards looked from Blackwood to the royal family, and Isabella could see the moment when many of them realized that they were being asked to choose between their legitimate sovereigns and a usurper who threatened to execute them if they hesitated to commit treason. Captain Thorne seized the moment. "Men, you know where your duty lies. You swore an oath to protect the royal family of Valdoria, not to enable ambitious courtiers to destroy them. Stand with your legitimate commanders." The response was swift and decisive. More than half of the guards in the room turned their weapons toward Blackwood and his remaining supporters. The carefully orchestrated coup was collapsing as those who were supposed to be its enforcers chose loyalty over personal gain. General Harrison found himself isolated with only a handful of supporters as his own men began to question their allegiance. The gruff military commander looked around the room, taking in the changed situation with the tactical awareness that had served him well in legitimate military campaigns. "Lord Blackwood," he said slowly, "it appears that your intelligence about the loyalty of our forces was as flawed as your intelligence about foreign threats. I withdraw my support for this enterprise." The betrayal of his military ally hit Blackwood like a physical blow. Without the backing of the kingdom's armed forces, his coup attempt was doomed to failure. But rather than surrender gracefully, he reached into his robes and produced a small crossbow, aiming it directly at Isabella. "If I cannot rule this kingdom, then I will ensure that none of you can either," he snarled. "The Queen's death will trigger a succession crisis that will tear Valdoria apart, leaving it vulnerable to conquest by stronger neighbors who appreciate effective leadership." The threat sent a chill through the room. Even in failure, Blackwood was determined to cause maximum damage to the kingdom he claimed to love. His finger tightened on the crossbow trigger, and Isabella found herself staring death in the face. But Alexander moved faster than anyone thought possible. With a warrior's instincts honed by years of training, he threw himself between Blackwood and Isabella just as the crossbow bolt flew across the room. The projectile struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the floor. "Alexander!" Isabella cried out, dropping to her knees beside the wounded prince. Blood was already seeping through his uniform, staining the fabric a dark crimson. Edmund's reaction was swift and terrible. With a roar of rage, he drew his sword and advanced on Blackwood, his face twisted with fury at seeing his brother wounded while protecting the woman Blackwood had tried to turn him against. "You have destroyed enough," Edmund declared, his blade at Blackwood's throat. "Your lies poisoned my mind against my family. Your ambitions nearly destroyed my kingdom, and now your spite has wounded the best man among us. It ends here." Blackwood's remaining supporters, seeing their leader captured and their cause lost, began laying down their weapons. The coup attempt that had seemed so carefully planned and inevitable just minutes earlier was collapsing into ignominious failure. But as Isabella knelt beside Alexander, pressing cloth against his wound to slow the bleeding, she realized that their victory was incomplete. Blackwood had been stopped, but the damage he had inflicted would take much longer to repair. Trust had been broken, relationships had been strained, and the kingdom's stability had been shaken to its foundations. "Alexander, stay with me," she whispered, urgently as the prince's eyes began to flutter closed. "We need you. The kingdom needs you." Alexander's lips curved in a weak smile. Did we win? He asked softly.
Yes, Isabella replied, though she wondered if any of them would truly emerge victorious from the wreckage of Blackwood's ambitions.
We won.
As Captain Thorne organized the arrest of the remaining conspirators and General Harrison began the process of securing the palace, Isabella looked up at Edmund.
Her husband stood over Blackwood's kneeling form, his sword still at the traitor's throat, his face a mixture of rage, shame, and something that might have been relief. The immediate crisis was over, but Isabella knew that the real work of rebuilding their kingdom, their marriage, and their family was just beginning. Some wounds heal quickly, but others leave scars that last a lifetime. Only time would tell which category their experiences would fall into. As guards moved to take Blackwood away, the defeated conspirator looked directly at Isabella with eyes filled with malevolent hatred. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his words meant for her alone. "I may have failed today, but the forces I've set in motion will continue to work against everything you represent. Valdoria will fall. If not today, then tomorrow, or the day after." Isabella met his gaze without flinching. "Perhaps," she replied softly. "But it will not fall because we gave up fighting for it. And it will not fall because we allowed fear to make us abandon everything that makes it worth protecting." As Blackwood was dragged from the throne room, Isabella turned her attention back to Alexander's wound. There would be time later to deal with the political aftermath of the evening's events. For now, her focus was on saving the life of the man who had saved hers, and on beginning the long process of healing the wounds that treachery had inflicted on everyone she loved. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the throne room, and the palace was slowly returning to something resembling normal life. Alexander was recovering well from his shoulder wound, though he would carry a scar as a permanent reminder of Blackwood's treachery. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the deeper work of rebuilding trust and repairing relationships was proving to be a much more complex undertaking. Isabella stood in her private study, reviewing reports from the kingdom's various provinces. The exposure of Blackwood's conspiracy had sent shockwaves throughout Valdoria, and she was working with Edmund to assess the full extent of the damage and begin the process of restoring stability. What they had discovered was both troubling and oddly reassuring. Troubling because Blackwood's influence had extended far beyond the palace walls. He had spent months cultivating supporters among the merchant classes, military commanders, and even some regional governors. His promises of greater autonomy and reduced oversight had appealed to those who saw democracy as an obstacle to their personal ambitions, but reassuring because the vast majority of Valdoria's people remained loyal to the constitutional monarchy and the principles it represented. When news of the coup attempt spread throughout the kingdom, spontaneous demonstrations of support for the royal family had erupted in cities and towns across the realm. The attempted betrayal had actually strengthened rather than weakened the bond between the crown and its subjects. A knock at the study door interrupted Isabella's thoughts. "Enter," she called, setting down the report she had been reading. Edmund stepped into the room, carrying a tea service and wearing an expression that mixed hope with uncertainty. Over the past 3 weeks, he had been working tirelessly to make amends for his role in Blackwood's plot, but the relationship between them remained strained and formal. "I thought you might like some tea," he said, setting the service on a small table near the window. "Lady Margaret mentioned that you've been working since dawn again." Isabella accepted the offered cup gratefully. She had indeed been working since sunrise, trying to coordinate the kingdom's response to various challenges that had emerged in the wake of the crisis. "Thank you. How is Alexander this morning?" "Restless and argumentative, which the physician says is a good sign," Edmund replied with a small smile. "He's demanding to be allowed to resume his duties, but the wound is still healing. I've ordered him to remain in his quarters for at least another week. He won't be happy about that. No, he won't. But he'll comply because he understands that his recovery serves the kingdom's interests." Edmund hesitated, then added, "He's been asking to speak with you, when you have time."
Isabella nodded.
"I'll visit him this afternoon. I want to discuss his ideas for reforming our intelligence gathering. His experience in the northern provinces gave him insights that might help us prevent future conspiracies." An awkward silence fell between them. Despite their professional cooperation over the past weeks, the personal dimension of their relationship remained unresolved. Edmund had apologized repeatedly for his treatment of her during Blackwood's manipulation, but words alone could not easily repair the damage that had been done. "Isabella," Edmund said quietly, "I know that my apologies can't undo the pain I caused you. I know that the things I said and did while under Blackwood's influence may have damaged our marriage beyond repair. But I want you to know that I'm committed to earning back your trust, no matter how long it takes. Isabella looked at her husband carefully. The past weeks had changed him in fundamental ways. The easy confidence of his early reign had been replaced by a more thoughtful, humble approach to leadership. He consulted more widely before making decisions, questioned his own assumptions more rigorously, and showed greater appreciation for the people who serve the kingdom faithfully. "Edmund," she said finally, "trust isn't something that can be earned back through grand gestures or formal apologies. It's rebuilt through consistent actions over time, through choosing to do the right thing even when it's difficult or inconvenient."
"I understand that," he replied.
"And I hope that you'll give me the opportunity to prove that the man you married is still here, underneath the mistakes and the manipulation." Before Isabella could respond, Captain Thorne entered the study after a brief knock.
His expression was serious, suggesting that he brought news of some importance.
"Your Majesties," he said, offering a respectful bow. "I apologize for the interruption, but I have information that requires your immediate attention." "What is it, Captain?" Edmund asked, his tone shifting immediately to that of a king dealing with affairs of state. "We've received word from our border guards that a delegation from the Kingdom of Astoria has arrived unexpectedly. They're requesting an immediate audience with your Majesty regarding urgent matters of mutual concern." Isabella and Edmund exchanged glances. The Astorian delegation that had been expected 3 weeks earlier had never arrived, leading to speculation about whether they had been involved in Blackwood's conspiracy or had simply been delayed by other circumstances. "Did they provide any details about the nature of these urgent matters?" Isabella asked. "The delegation is led by Prince Marcus of Astoria, and he specifically mentioned that he has information about Lord Blackwood's activities that predates our recent crisis. He claims to have evidence that the former Lord Chancellor was in communication with enemies of both our kingdoms." The implications were staggering. If Prince Marcus was telling the truth, then Blackwood's treachery had extended beyond Valdoria's borders. He might have been working with foreign powers to destabilize the region, using his attempted coup as part of a larger strategy to weaken the constitutional monarchies that posed obstacles to more aggressive neighbors. "Where is Prince Marcus now?" Edmund asked. In the diplomatic quarters, along with his security detail and advisors, he requested that the audience take place as soon as possible, as he claims to have information about imminent threats to both our kingdoms. Isabella stood up, her diplomatic instincts taking over. "We should meet with him immediately. If he has evidence about Blackwood's foreign connections, we need to hear it before those connections can be used against us." "Agreed," Edmund replied. "Captain Thorne, please escort Prince Marcus to the Blue Drawing Room. We'll meet with him there in 15 minutes. As the captain left to make the arrangements, Isabella and Edmund found themselves alone again, but now united by a common purpose rather than divided by personal conflicts. The crisis had taught them both valuable lessons about the importance of trust, communication, and shared commitment to something larger than themselves. "Isabella," Edmund said as they prepared to leave the study, "whatever Prince Marcus has to tell us, whatever new challenges we're about to face, I want you to know that we'll face them together. No more secrets, no more decisions made in isolation, no more allowing others to come between us." Isabella looked at her husband and saw sincerity in his eyes that reminded her why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. The man who had courted her with poetry and dreams of building a better kingdom was still there, perhaps stronger for having faced and overcome his own weaknesses. "Together," she agreed, taking his offered arm as they walked toward what might be another crucial moment in their kingdom's history. The Blue Drawing Room was one of the palace's more intimate spaces for receiving foreign dignitaries. Furnished with comfortable seating and decorated with paintings depicting peaceful scenes from Valdoria's past, it was designed to encourage open and honest conversation rather than formal ceremony. Prince Marcus of Astoria was a tall, athletic man in his early 30s with intelligent brown eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to both military command and diplomatic negotiations. He rose respectfully as Edmund and Isabella entered, offering a formal bow that acknowledged their sovereignty while maintaining his own dignity. "Your Majesties," he said, "thank you for agreeing to see me on such short notice. I apologize for the unusual circumstances of my arrival, but the information I carry could not wait for normal diplomatic procedures." "Please be seated," Edmund replied, gesturing toward the comfortable chairs arranged around a small table. "We understand that you have information about our former Lord Chancellor's activities that may affect both our kingdoms." Prince Marcus nodded grimly. "Indeed I do. 3 months ago, Lord Blackwood approached our court through intermediaries, proposing a secret alliance between certain factions in Astoria and Valdoria. His plan involved replacing your constitutional monarchy with a more authoritarian system that would be amenable to economic and military cooperation with similar regimes in neighboring kingdoms. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of cooperation? The formation of a confederation of autocratic states that would dominate this entire region through military force and economic intimidation. Democratic governments like yours were seen as obstacles to this vision because they couldn't commit to long-term military alliances without parliamentary approval, and they insisted on honoring international laws that limited aggressive expansion. Edmund leaned forward intently. Are you saying that Blackwood was working with foreign powers to overthrow our government? Not exactly, Prince Marcus replied carefully. Blackwood approached us, but my father, King Robert, rejected his proposals immediately. We have no interest in destabilizing our neighbors or abandoning the principles of international law that have kept our region peaceful for decades. But we have reason to believe that Blackwood found more receptive audiences in other courts. Which courts? Isabella asked, though she dreaded the answer. The kingdoms of Belgrave and Corvonia have both experienced recent changes in leadership that brought more militant factions to power. Our intelligence suggests that they were very interested in Blackwood's proposals, seeing them as an opportunity to expand their territories and influence without facing resistance from a united coalition of democratic neighbors. The picture that emerged from Prince Marcus's revelations was far more frightening than anything Blackwood had shown Edmund to justify his coup attempt. Instead of defending Valdoria from external threats, Blackwood had been working to create those very threats as justification for abandoning the democratic principles that actually protected the kingdom from aggressive neighbors. What evidence do you have of these communications? Edmund asked. Prince Marcus gestured to one of his advisors, who produced a leather portfolio similar to the one Blackwood had used to deceive Edmund. But when Isabella examined these documents, she found genuine diplomatic correspondence, intercepted communications, and intelligence reports that painted a clear picture of a conspiracy that extended far beyond Valdoria's borders. This is why we came as quickly as possible, Prince Marcus continued. Our sources suggest that Belgrave and Corvonia were expecting Blackwood's coup to succeed, after which they would offer military assistance to help him maintain power in exchange for territorial concessions and trade agreements that would benefit their kingdoms at Valdoria's expense. And now that the coup has failed? Edmund asked. Now they face a choice between accepting the failure of their strategy or attempting to achieve their goals through more direct military action. Our border guards have reported unusual military movements in both kingdoms over the past 2 weeks. They may be planning to invade while they believe Valdoria is still weakened by internal conflict. Isabella and Edmund exchanged glances, both understanding that their personal reconciliation would have to wait. Their kingdom faced external threats that made Blackwood's internal treachery seem like a minor inconvenience by comparison. Prince Marcus, Isabella said, what kind of assistance is Astoria prepared to offer if our neighbors do decide to pursue military solutions? My father has authorized me to propose a formal alliance between our kingdoms, based on mutual defense and shared commitment to constitutional governance. We believe that a united response to aggression is the best way to preserve peace and stability in our region. Edmund nodded slowly. We would welcome such an alliance. But first, we need to prepare our own defenses and ensure that our people are ready for whatever challenges may come. As the meeting continued, Isabella felt a sense of purpose and determination that had been missing during the dark weeks of Blackwood's manipulation. The kingdom faced serious threats, but they would face them with eyes wide open, allies at their side, and principles intact. The real test of their marriage, their leadership, and their kingdom's strength was just beginning. But for the first time in months, Isabella felt confident that they would meet that test successfully, whatever the cost might be. Outside the palace windows, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, but inside the blue drawing room, plans were being made to weather whatever tempests might come. The kingdom of Valdoria would survive, not because it had abandoned its principles in the face of threats, but because it had chosen to defend them when defending them mattered most. As Prince Marcus concluded his presentation and arrangements were made for formal alliance negotiations, Isabella realized that Blackwood's greatest failure had not been his inability to seize power. It had been his fundamental misunderstanding of what made kingdoms truly strong. Strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the courage to stand for something worth defending, even when standing alone. Valdoria would not stand alone much longer, but its strength had never depended on the presence or absence of allies. It had always come from the character of its people and the principles they chose to uphold. That strength had been tested in recent weeks, and it had proven sufficient to the challenge. Whatever tests lay ahead, Isabella was confident they would prove sufficient to those challenges as well.